Great. Welcome, everybody. It looks like we have a very full room, so a lot of people here to hear this very exciting talk. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Yeling Tan from the University of Oxford. Yeling is Professor of Public Policy at the Blavatnik School in Oxford. She's had a very illustrious academic career before Oxford, from Princeton, Oregon, Stanford, Harvard, very, very exciting, and also has published several books, which I know that I'm often recommending to my students and that I'm sure some of you are familiar with. In particular, the most recent book on disaggregating China Inc. has been very influential. And Yeling is going to talk about China's evolving approach to economic security. So we'll have about 40 to 45 minutes of talk, and then I will stop you and nicely, and we will have a little bit of time for Q&A as well. This is being recorded, by the way, so if there is anything that is particularly sensitive or you're not keen to have on the recording, probably don't say it in this session. Thanks.
All right, thanks very much, Charlotte, and thank you to the organizers for this very kind invitation to speak here. This is a piece of my ongoing research, so I'm really excited to share the initial draft and conceptual framework with you all, and then to get your feedback on ways to improve and other ways to think about the question. So, in terms of China's evolving approach to economic security, let me start by taking a step back, right? If we look around the world today, major governments of major economies are all concerned with this idea of economic security, right? We see Biden and former PM Rishi Sunak talking about economic security, Ursula von der Leyen with the EU revealing presenting an economic security strategy for Europe. China itself, of course, thinking about supply chains and ways to shore up its own national economic security, and between India and China as well. So this is a topic and priority that's top of mind for leaders, for governments, for politicians. But it's not really a concept, to me anyway, that's well understood between the leaders of these governments, right? Between leaders, between government agencies and bureaucracies. What do leaders mean when they use that term economic security? When they say they want to strengthen economic security, what does it mean for their own country and for the other party that they're having dialogue with? When we have ambiguity over meaning in bilateral, multilateral, international discussions, this raises the possibility that there's misunderstanding in communications, right? I'm saying economic security, you're saying economic security. We think we're talking about the same thing, but we're actually holding divergent meanings. The risk of this is that states can unwittingly enter into an economic security dilemma, right? If I do something that I think I'm shoring up my economic security for in a defensive way, you might interpret it as an offensive measure. You ramp up your economic security measures in a defensive way. I interpret it as being an offensive measure, and we're off to the races, right? You get this tit for tat escalation based on a misunderstanding of what each country actually means. And this raises the possibility of a range of unintended consequences, including unintended conflict. So in this ongoing research, I want to take a step back, in a sense, and try to understand and try to get greater conceptual clarity over this idea of economic security from one of the major countries that we would be concerned with, and that is China. So in terms of research questions that I'm tackling here that I am happy to share with you, right? First of all, what does the Chinese party state mean when it uses this term, economic security? And secondly, how do China's approaches to economic security vary both over time and across issue areas? So I'll discuss a little bit on each of these questions in my presentation today. In terms of what I'll go through, I'll very, very quickly just go through what my data sources are and my methodology for answering these questions. And then I'm going to take a step back to say, well, what are the origins of this term economic security in the Chinese context? And then present for you a typology of different approaches that the Chinese party state adopts, right, in governing economic security, and then look at change over time, both in terms of the overall approach being adopted by China and across a specific issue area, one which I'm sure everyone is very concerned with today, and that is the technology realm. So that's our overall roadmap for today. So data and methods, it's a pretty straightforward approach that I'm adopting here. So I collected an original corpus of documents, right, issued by China's central party state, which mention the term economic security. It's not a very large corpus because I'm focusing on the central government here. But it spans about a 25-year period from 1998 to 2023. And what I do first is to just read, right? Read these documents to try to understand the deeper contextual environment and meaning in which this term is embedded and try to track how it changes over time. And then to the extent feasible, use quantitative methods to try to verify some of the trends that I'm observing qualitatively. This figure here shows you a count over time. So the data extends from 98 to 2023, right? The bars just show the overall raw count of documents collected. And then the colors show you the categorization by issuing authority, right? So red would be documents issued by the Communist Party, right? Most often the Central Committee. Purple are ministries, central ministries within Beijing. Green is the executive body, the State Council. Blue would be the National People's Congress. And then there's a more miscellaneous category, right? So some of these would be trade associations or industry associations, chambers, and so on. As I read through the documents, I started coding them up by issue area, right? What is this document concerned about? And this figure here gives you a rough sense of the issue areas spanning the data set that I collected, right? And they're fairly straightforward. These topics are topics that you would expect to appear in many governments that are concerned with economic security, right? So external liberalization, financial stability, information security, technology, and so on. Somewhat more unique to the China context, a fair number of documents are concerned with the governance of state-owned enterprises. You see a focus on critical infrastructure, energy and resource security. And then as we go along, and I'll elaborate more on this as I move forward in the presentation, this emerging focus over time on what China calls its comprehensive national security concept. And I'll elaborate on what that means. But just a quick overview of what topics these documents tend to be concerned with. So that's the data and a quick overview of what the documents look like. I want you to take a step back now and look at origins of the term, right? And there are two ways to think about this. First is just to look at when this term appears in normal policymaking discourse in China. And if we just look at that very specific, rather narrow approach of thinking about origins, you see that the term, and this is corroborated by secondary literature, really appears in usage around 1998, right, during the Asian financial crisis, where we had major regional economies come under, their currencies came under speculative attack. There was contagion across the broader Asian region, and that triggered a rethinking across many countries in the region, including China, on how to manage and navigate the relationship between liberalization, right, just the capital account, just the current account, or also the capital account. What kinds of vulnerabilities does that invite into your domestic financial system? So that is a more specific pinpointing of when that term emerges. But when you look at how the concept is then interpreted and fleshed out, I think we need to go even further back in time to consider how the framing of the concept, right, as it becomes fleshed out, is shaped both by history and by political ideology. And this is what I would like to elaborate on a little for the next couple of slides. So let's first talk about history, right? When reading through these documents, you get a sense that the way in which the Chinese Party state approaches this idea of economic security is deeply shaped by its own historical narrative of how China became weak in the first place, right? If we think about the current quest is to strengthen the nation, well, then we need to understand how China became weak, or how China itself frames its national narrative of weakness. So of course, to go back, this brings us back to the century of humiliation, right? Roughly spanning from the Opium Wars to the end of the Second World War, then Civil War, and then the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949. And here, there are both domestic and external dimensions to this period of weakness, right? The narrative of the century of humiliation tends to focus in relative terms more on the external dimension. In particular, China's encounter in the 19th century with a form of globalization that was fairly coercive, right? If we think about imperialist forces, right, and in particular, China's military loss, right, with imperial powers from the West and from Japan, the defeat militarily that oftentimes was then followed by the concession of pieces of critical infrastructure, right, in particular treaty ports, right, and these are called the unequal treaties, right, in China's own domestic political narrative and history. And think about the ways in which many of these, in particular the Opium Wars, right, there was a backdrop of unequal trade, right? In the earlier period, right, Great Britain was concerned about unequal trade with China because it was purchasing a lot of silk and tea and porcelain and so on, and suffering a trade deficit, right? And then with opium, right, as the main export from Great Britain's empire into China, that formed a different type of reliance and a different type of vulnerability, a different type of inequity. Right, so this is important backdrop because all of these events are associated with the collapse of the Qing dynasty, right? As many of you are already familiar with, right? Of course, the collapse of the Qing dynasty is not only due to these external forces. There were a lot of domestic problems as well. But here I'm emphasizing it, the official narrative, right, emphasizes the external. And so as we look at nationalism in China and how it emerges in the 20th century, right, it emerges with an underlying sense of urgency and importance around this question of how to maintain and regain and maintain control over key economic infrastructure. And this is something that's shared by nationalist and communist parties alike, right? It's a broader sense of nationalism. So that's the history piece of the backdrop I want to emphasize. And then there's, of course, political ideology, right? So when the Communist Party takes over, it brings with it this question of how to apply communist ideology to the project to strengthen and rejuvenate the nation, right? And so you see in the documents that I collected, a fairly consistent emphasis on this idea of economic lifelines, right, which connects back to Leninist ideology about the need for the party to secure the commanding heights of an economy, right? So this translates into communist ideology, and it translates into economic policies with an overarching focus on key infrastructure. Just what these key infrastructure are, right, is never really specified in a list, but the overall idea would be your energy resources, railways, ports, right, aviation, and so on. And you see this focus on economic lifelines enshrined in very, very early founding documents in the People's Republic. So prior to the official constitution being established, right, there was a sort of a draft constitution that was promulgated in 1949. And even back then, you see a focus on economic lifelines, right? So just pulling out one quote here that says, any industry related to the lifeline of the national economy, crucial to the livelihoods of the people, should be operated under the unified management of the state, right? So this is a concern that goes back quite far in time. And it infuses China's overall approach, right? I'm going to skip over the Mao period here, and just to move, as China moves into the reform period, right? There's obviously great energy focused on liberalization and growing out of the plan, experimentation, and so on. But this idea of maintaining control over economic lifelines persists, right? Even through the reform period into the 1990s and into the Asian financial crisis. So this is the backdrop that I want to emphasize, going into the more the reform and post-reform period that we're all familiar with. So with this backdrop in mind, I would like to present a brief way, a typology of thinking about the ways in which the Chinese party state then goes on to approach this task of governing economic security. So let me walk you through this typology. It's fairly straightforward, right? So we can think about China's approaches to economic security governance as being defined by two types of, by purpose and by posture. Purpose, right, is the overall project market building, or is it market curbing? Posture, right, is the overall posture, a defensive one or an offensive one. And what do we mean by these types of purposes and these types of postures, right? So if we think about market building, what's the logic of this purpose here? Fairly straightforward, right? We know that China enters this period of reform and opening, where it's trying to establish functioning markets in an incremental sense, especially in the 1980s, in a more deliberate sense as we move into the 1990s. But the underlying logic is that if we, in China, if China builds strong markets, that will strengthen the economy, which will strengthen the nation, right? That's the ultimate goal here, to strengthen the nation. As we move in this market building project, right, liberalization can create security spillovers. Because building markets is disruptive, building institutions takes time. These institutions can be weak, they can be leaky. That creates security risks. And those security risks can threaten the market building project. It threatens the liberalization process. Therefore, state intervention is needed to address these security spillovers so as to enhance market functions, right? So as to keep that market building project going forward in a smooth fashion, rather than having these security spillovers, if unaddressed, can threaten the market, undermine the market, and derail the liberalization process. Now, in contrast, there is a separate market curbing purpose that we also see in the documents, right? And here it's a slightly different logic, right? As China engages in market liberalization, there is a threat over who maintains and who gains control over economic lifelines, right? So this is why I spent a bit of time elaborating on the importance of economic lifelines in the historical and political context of China. And in this logic, a loss of control over economic lifelines generates vulnerability. It generates vulnerability to coercion akin to the types that China experienced in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Because if control is ceded to either private firms or foreign firms, these firms cannot be trusted to operate in the nation's best interest. Oops. So therefore, we need state intervention to curb the reach of the markets, right? Whereas in the market building purpose, it was state intervention is needed to strengthen the functioning of the market, right? To build a strong economy and then a strong nation. Here, the market building project needs guardrails, right? It needs to be curbed in order to maintain control over economic lifelines. So you see these two purposes, right, emerging and sort of sitting in tension with each other throughout the 25-year period that I'm examining here from 1998 to 2023. We can also see differences in the approach in terms of posture, right? Defensive versus offensive. And the logics here are, I would say, pretty intuitive, right? In a defensive way of governing economic security, the state attempts to intercept, to diffuse, to block perceived economic threats, either as they arise or in anticipation of such threats arising. So it's about intercepting, blocking, diffusing, right, in a defensive manner. In contrast, if we look at an offensive approach, right, these approaches are focused on ways to actively overcome perceived security threats, either by direct repression, by active prosecution, or by expansive or extraterritorial methods, right, reaching beyond China's territorial shores to go after perceived economic threats or to be able to overcome perceived future vulnerabilities. So if we put these two concepts together, right, purpose and posture, what we end up with are four governance roles toward in economic security, right? First of all, an inspector role that is defensive market building in nature, coupled with that a prosecutor role that is offensive market building in nature, a planner role that's defensive market curbing in nature, and a warrior role that is offensive market curbing in nature. If you look at the documents, right, you see these roles being manifested and being deployed not in mutual exclusion, but really in a mixture, right? And they can be jointly deployed in any given issue area and in any given point in time. But there are trends over time that I'd like to highlight later on in the talk. So let me then now flesh out what each of these roles look like when we read the documents, starting with the inspector role, right? So this is a defensive market building approach, right? The overall goal here is to strengthen markets in order to strengthen the nation. And so this approach emphasizes a lot the need for strong surveillance capabilities in order to screen out harmful elements, elements that might undermine the functioning of the market, right? And a lot of these documents are therefore concerned with enforcement of health and safety standards, accounting standards, and so on. They also emphasize the need to cooperate internationally with counterparts in order to share information and to set benchmarks for what counts as a reliable exchange of goods, what counts as a reliable exchange of firm information, and so on. So when we see the documents, we see that the inspector role tends to be fairly prevalent in a few issue areas, right? So at the border, right, customs, inspection and quarantine agencies discuss the need to safeguard national economic security in order to strengthen trading flows, right? In order to strengthen the project of trade liberalization. Because if the customs and quarantine agencies let in harmful elements, right, that can create mistrust in the market, mistrust in consumers, and that can undermine the reliability of trade. We also see auditing functions, auditing agencies in China talking about the need to strengthen economic security by ensuring that there's no accounting fraud in the domestic system. And they even talk about themselves as serving as the quote unquote immune system of the national economy. Right, so this again underscores the market building spirit in which this approach to national economic security is being taken, right? In order to build a healthy economy, we need strong auditing capabilities to guard against, harmful economic diseases, right? So they're thinking about themselves as boosting the immunity and overall health of the economy. And then we also have an emphasis on early warning, right? So rather than wait for these risks to emerge, there's an emphasis on building out capabilities to intercept some of these risks before they emerge. And therefore, an emphasis on the need for international cooperation between law enforcement agencies, between standard setting bodies, and to provide mutual administrative assistance so as to strengthen the overall functioning of the national economy within a system of globalization. So that's the defensive approach, right? There's also an offensive approach to market building that complements the inspector role, and this is the state as prosecutor. Right here, this is about actively going after criminal elements, right? Criminal elements that might be trying to exploit loopholes in the emerging market system in China. So you see here, I've provided a quote from the Supreme People's Procuratorate, right? Talking about as reforms advance, various social conflicts might increase, right? And the overall volume of criminal cases is on the rise, violent crime, serious economic crime, organized crime, and that undermines China's security situation, right? Therefore, and this is the late 1990s that you're talking about, right? There's an overall need to maintain political stability and alongside that national economic security. So this is about crime fighting, right? This is about making sure that economic crime is prosecuted and that the law is enforced. There's an emphasis here in particular on trying to grapple with smuggling and financial crime, right? So you see here the Ministry of Foreign Trade and Economic Cooperation. This is the precursor to the Ministry of Commerce today, discussing unauthorized fundraising, the unauthorized establishment of financial institutions, unauthorized financial operations, because this undermines China's overall approach to either keeping their exchange rate stable or keeping the flow of critical inputs such as oil and so on stable and secure. So that's the prosecutor role. Let me now move on to talking about the market curbing side of the 2x2 diagram. So in terms of defensive market curbing, right, we see the state acting here as a planner to try to strategically intervene, oftentimes to curb the reach of capital flows, both short-term and long-term, right? So in terms of short-term, you see many of the documents discussing the need for intervention to maintain the fixed exchange rate, right? And this, in a sense, goes back to this concern with financial fraud and fraudulent invoicing in trade flows that might otherwise lead to a weak fixed exchange rate that can't be defended. We see this approach in China's foreign investment guiding catalog, which many of you I'm sure are familiar with, right? It goes through all the different industries in China and then sets out for each industry whether foreign investment is fully allowed, whether it's partially allowed, whether there are joint venture requirements for any foreign capital coming in, and if there are joint venture requirements, is there a need for majority control by the Chinese side, or is the sector completely closed off to foreign investment, right? This is a very active planning role to controlling foreign capital flows, and an overall emphasis here, again, back to economic lifelines, right? These, you see the most active curbing of market forces whenever it comes to industries and sectors that are deemed to fall under this broad concept of economic lifelines. And the overall approach, right, as I mentioned earlier, you see these market curbing and market building tendencies working side by side and basically sometimes in tension with each other, right? The overall approach, I would say, is encapsulated in this piece from the National People's Congress in 2001 as China joins the World Trade Organization, right? This was China's big leap into integrating with global rules on trade. And it says, as China joins the WTO, right, it needs to gradually open up the market, right, to ensure that the country controls the lifeline of the national economy and safeguards national economic security. So even as it opens its doors and lowers tariffs to foreign imports and welcomes foreign investment, there's still this underlying concern with where the reach of the market needs to be curbed in order to maintain economic security. Moving on now to the last box there, the offensive market curbing approach, or state as warrior. So here, right, we're talking about building out capabilities in an extraterritorial sense, right? Whereas the defensive approach was more about making sure foreign capital doesn't come in or gain a monopolistic position in critical sectors. Here we're looking at an approach that goes beyond that preventive approach and is offensive in terms of thinking about how China needs to have reach and capabilities in these economic lifelines. So most salient here would be the shipping industry, right? And here you see the Ministry of Transport, right, in 2001, this is the same year as China's accession to the WTO, discussing the need to elevate the position of China's international shipping in order to ensure economic security, right? So it needs to improve the structure of its fleet, right, attract the return of ships flying the Chinese flag, expand the shipping size, and enhancing China's overall standing in maritime shipping. That's one sectoral approach to thinking about an offensive market curbing strategy. But as we move, and I'll start to elaborate on this now in the next section, as we move into the post-2014 period, we see a different concept emerge that really encapsulates this offensive market curbing warrior approach to economic security. And this is an approach that tries to frame and put together a holistic way of thinking about national economic security and trying to articulate where that sits within China's overall thinking about national security. So 2014 was when this idea of a comprehensive national security concept is put into the public discussion and public discourse. 2015, we see the national security law being promulgated. And here you start to see a framework emerging, right? Where the comprehensive national security concept, right, is about ensuring people's safety with political security as being the fundamental aspect, economic security as the foundation, and then we have military, cultural, social security as the safeguards. And this moves us into a different way of thinking about economic security again, and I'll elaborate more on this in the next section, which is really about change over time, right? So 2014, 2015, we see this concept emerge, right? It takes a bit of time to actually take hold and become fleshed out. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the triggers that lead to a deepening of this warrior approach to governing economic security. So first, change over time. What I want to look at here is the emergence of this warrior state, right? With 2014, as I've just laid out, being the rough turning point, right? And this is a slow turning point, right? It's not an overnight shift. But if there is a real change in China's approach, then we would expect to see differences in the context in which economic security is discussed within the documents. So to tease out these differences, I use a very simple word embedding exercise, right? And word embeddings is basically just asking this question of, given a key term, economic security, what words are most commonly associated? What words most commonly co-occur with our key term here when we look at the corpus? And I split the corpus into two, right? Prior to 2014, so 1998 to 2014, and then 1998 to 2013, and then 2014 to 2023. If there's no change over time, we should expect to see that the word embedding exercise reveals roughly similar words, right? And that would tell us that China's contextual approach, the context in which economic security is being discussed, is not changing over time. We see through this exercise that it is changing over time. So prior to the national security, comprehensive security concept being promulgated, right, the words most highly associated with economic security in the earlier period from 1998 to 2013 are really about market building, right? Legal rights, law, compliance, market order, infringement, fairness, prevention. You can see sort of this effort at market building here, right? Building a rule of, building out a market order that is undergirded by legal enforcement. In the second period, you see a very different contextual environment. National security is the #1 word most closely associated with economic security. Nation, social stability, politics, public safety, right? So a closer linkage between economic security and broader political considerations, broader concerns with social stability and politics. So a change over time through this word embedding exercise. Here's another way of looking at it, right? So this is a figure showing overall prevalence of 2 different types of terms. The solid line here is just the prevalence of the term economic security, right, in my data set. And it doesn't vary very much over time. You wouldn't expect it to. The dashed line are terms that are associated with comprehensive security. And you can see that vertical line I've drawn in the figure there is 2014. Roughly speaking, you can see an elevation in terms associated with comprehensive security becoming increasing in prevalence post 2014 compared to pre-2014. Here's another way of looking at it, right? So if you look on the right-hand side, these are the various words that I coded, which we all know are associated with comprehensive national security. These are terms that have been used in China's various documents, right? You might see it in the 5-year plan. You might see it in Xi Jinping's report at the 20th Party Congress. But it's a lot of different types of security that are now all falling under this comprehensive umbrella, right? Network security, information security, data security, tech security, public security, people security, social security, energy security, food security, and so on, right? So by the end, as we come into the 2020s, right, it's really this multi-dimensional proliferation of a security framing over many aspects of China's economy and society. So this is a broad change that we can see over time. I want to delve a little bit now into technology security, technology and economic security. So here, if we talk about how China's approach has changed over time, when we look at the documents, we can see in the earlier period, right, the Chinese party state really grappling with a dilemma, right? How to strengthen China's technological capabilities while reducing its vulnerabilities to external coercion, right? It's aware of this dilemma from the beginning, right? If you want to make gains in innovation, the gains in innovation lie outside your borders, right? So to get those gains, you have to reach out and you have to engage with the globalized system of innovation. When you do that, de facto, right, it comes at a cost, which is there's underlying, we don't know, it's hard to calculate, but there's an overall increase in vulnerability to potential coercion. We don't know how high the risks are. We don't know when they might happen, but it's an inherent dilemma. So how does the Chinese party state try to resolve this dilemma? It tries to do both things at the same time, right? It tries to get the best of both worlds. It tries to do market curbing and market building simultaneously, right? So we see here the Central Committee in 1999 talking about the need to combine, on the one hand, indigenous research and development efforts, right? So as to reduce that vulnerability, to combine that with importing and assimilating foreign advanced technologies, right? And this also involves building out a more marketized system to invite in foreign technology, collaboration, foreign capital, and so on. So it tries to do both, right, in the hopes that over time, the indigenous side of the development efforts can reduce China's overall vulnerability. But the approach and the attempt to get the best of both worlds ends with mixed results, right? So this is in 2006, we see the Ministry of Science and Technology talking about how the approach hasn't worked, right? Especially when it comes to semiconductors and semiconductor software, right? And the Ministry of Science and Technology here is talking about how in this arena, China is basically dependent on imports. It lacks independent development capabilities. And this is a challenge to national economic security. It's a challenge to defense security, right? So it's aware of this from, almost 18 years ago at this point. But it's still facing this dilemma, right? Being forced to choose between advancing to the frontier and increasing a vulnerability versus reducing a vulnerability, but not advancing to the frontier. It's a very difficult dilemma to resolve. What we see happening, there are several events that trigger China's shift towards a more warrior mentality and a more self-reliant approach to technology. One of which is, of course, the geopolitical tensions that arise between the United States and China around this question of technology and semiconductor export controls. So this is a figure from a separate paper that I'm working on with a few co-authors. So this is an analysis of words related to technology decoupling across about 500,000 news articles from China's official state media, news articles related to science and technology. So within the science and tech realm, when do we see concerns about decoupling emerge, right? And we see very clearly you can track the emergence of concerns with decoupling, with choke points and so on from the middle of 2018 onwards. And then you see a continued increase in China's national newspapers over this need for decoupling and reducing vulnerabilities to being exposed to choke points. And then the peak there that you see is the 2021 14th five-year plan. When it's promulgated, there's a lot of emphasis on technology self-reliance, right? So one trigger that pushes China towards this more warrior mentality as a way of resolving the dilemma is US-China tensions. I would say prior to that, there are also other causal factors, one of which is this realization that the attempt to get the best of both worlds simply isn't working. So then we see from the late 2010s onwards, right? Rather than talking about the need for technology advancement, right, the discourse changes. In particular, we see the elevation of technology into the comprehensive national security concept, right? Whereas in the national security law, we had three issues being labeled as safeguards, right? Military, cultural, social security. By 2019, you see the Central Committee including technology, right, in this overall political phraseology, right? Military, technology, cultural, social security. So now technology is being elevated to a key national security concern. And alongside there, you see an increased emphasis on party control, right? So it's not even just about curbing the market. It's that the party needs to be in control of these technological development, right? The need to strengthen the party's overall leadership in science and technology work. Phrases such as independent and controllable, the need to achieve security and control. You start seeing the word control show up over and over and over again when it comes to technology concerns. So, having laid out for you so far, the origins of the term, the importance of history and ideology, right? And then laying out this typology, right? The inspector, prosecutor, planner, warrior role, right? What are the implications for where we find ourselves today and this danger that I mentioned at the start of this talk about states unwittingly entering into an economic security dilemma? So from this ongoing research project, right, what have we found so far? First of all, when it comes to this question of how China approaches this economic security and what it means, right? It's really a multidimensional concept. It's dynamic. It changes over time, even as it's undergirded and bounded by key enduring concerns over economic lifelines, right? And not all economic security policies, therefore, have escalatory consequences. For example, if we go back to this idea of market building, right, you can adopt an offensive prosecutorial role in building markets. without triggering an escalation in bilateral or international relations. Because this prosecutorial approach is about fighting crime that undermines market functions, and it emphasizes actually international cooperation, sharing of data between prosecutorial agencies, between police agencies, right, setting standards and so on. So it doesn't necessarily need to trigger escalation. And this is in contrast with traditional studies in international security that really emphasize the misperceptions of offensive versus defensive as the crux, right, as the trigger for an escalation into a traditional security dilemma. In the economic realm, right, I don't really see this as being the key trigger, right? In fact, what's more likely to drive states into an economic security dilemma is with the market curbing policies. Because even when it comes to market curbing policies, even defensive approaches can trigger escalation, as we see in the planner role, right? Because market access is a bounded resource. Right. And when I curb the investment flows coming in from other countries in order to protect market access, in order to protect the market share of my state-owned enterprises, I am de facto denying it to somebody else. Right. I might be adopting this in a defensive way to maintain control over what I see as vital to national security. But it's seen as offensive to foreign firms because they're being denied profits. They're being denied the chance to grow, right? And that can trigger escalation. And we can see this escalation in the reports of foreign firms embedded in China over time, right? If we look at US-China Business Council, the European Business Council, and so on, you can see over time stronger and more vociferous complaints coming from firms based in China, foreign firms based in China about the market access that they're being denied. So to escape the economic security dilemma, therefore, accurate signaling of posture alone is insufficient, right? And here I'm, delving more into policy implications now. What can governments do, right? It's more about thinking about the right balance between market curbing and market building strategies that I think will bring us further towards finding ways to resolve an unwitting sleepwalking into an economic security dilemma. So with that, I thank you very much for your patience and for listening, and I really look forward to your questions, to your feedback and suggestions on how to improve this work. So thank you very much.
So we don't have too long for questions. Let's just get a sense of how many questions are in the room. Okay, quite a lot. Shall we gather 3 and then see if we have any more time after that? Let's take 1. Where else for questions? At the back and 3 over there. Yes. Yeah, please.
Thank you very much for that talk. It was absolutely brilliant. Could you say something about whether it's really possible in the context of great power competition for the US and China to resolve their differences in interpretation about what economic security might mean?
Nice and succinct. Thank you. Yeah, and at the back.
Start with the easy questions, right?
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. My question to you is to kind of expand on your last point, where you were talking about what might de-escalate in terms of thinking through the market curbing. Could you give an example of where you think this might have successfully been done, the anticipation of economic securities dilemmas?
And then there was one more. Yeah.
Thanks. There've been quite a few allegations over the years of China adopting an innovation mercantilist approach to decimating the capabilities, for example, in solar panels, whatever, abroad for their own benefit. To what degree do you accept that concept? And if so, is this part of an economic security plan? And is that in turn related to the warrior states concept you've just been talking about?
Thank you. So Yeling, over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, really easy questions. It's on. So I think the first two questions are quite related, right? You know, are there, what measures can the US and China take to resolve their differences, which would involve de-escalation? So this is a really tricky one because the way I've laid it out, right? It's a de facto difference, right? Even if the traditional international security relations literature would emphasize signaling and resolving misperceptions as a way to escape the dilemma. But in the case of market curbing policies, to me, that is insufficient because of the fact that market access and market share is a limited resource, right? Whereas security is something that's national security, military security is something that is more fungible. And so in terms of trying to resolve questions of market access and reciprocity, I think it's very difficult to de-escalate just by signaling. Layered upon that, we have to take into account the fact that many of the technologies that are being discussed right now are de facto dual use. So not only is market share something that is simply about dividing up a limited pie, technology, when it's dual use, is dual use. So no amount of signaling can resolve the fact that there's dual use technology and that there's a risk of civilian technologies, you know, being used not just in the civilian realm, but in the military realm. So I would say it's incredibly difficult, but I think that it shouldn't deter states from talking to each other, right? This is what diplomacy is about, resolving those very difficult issues that we can't immediately see an answer to, right? Because underlying this, right, is what I believe neither state wants to be in an economic security dilemma. This is the unwitting part of it, right? So given that neither wants to be in a security dilemma that might lead to unintended consequences, right? There is still nevertheless a need to sit down and figure out solutions that don't appear to exist at the moment, right? For us lay people sitting in the room. This is the hard work of diplomacy, right? It might be about designing alternative measures for reassurances, right? So if we think about, for example, fears of being vulnerable to coercion by either side, there are solutions to that, right? Stockpiling is one solution, right? And we can think about ways in which nations can collaborate in stockpiling, you know, critical inputs, critical goods, critical supplies, and that diffuses the ability for the other party to engage in coercion. So it's about thinking about ways around the situation where I think a lot of hard work needs to occur. And then the other question on mercantilism in the innovation sphere and the decimation of technologies for, you're talking about firms, Chinese firms gaining technologies and then gaining market share and so on, right? Yeah.
Thank you very much. Of the impact of Chinese economic policy abroad. I mentioned solar panels, for example, and the way that they've been destroyed in Germany, Japan, etc., by unfair competition with investments, etc. But I want to know whether that concept is something that you recognise within the economic security framework.
Yeah. So the way I would think about this to try and unpack this, the quite murky international picture would be two things, right? First, in terms of the industry that you're talking about, does it fall under the category of economic lifelines, right? I don't think solar panels does. It falls under this category of incredibly lucrative emerging technology where there's a lot of profits to be gained. Secondly, I would look at the types of actors participating in that particular sector. Are they mostly state-owned, or is there a larger share of private sector firms as well? In solar panels, my impression is, I'm not an expert in that industry, is that there are a lot of private sector firms. And in that case, then I would think the profit motive would be ascendant here rather than some economic security strategy. But if we looked at a different industry, say shipping, right, then probably a different logic would be applied because it's both an economic lifeline and dominated by state-owned enterprises.
Let's take one more question, just time for, yeah, at the front. Sorry, I'm making you run around with the mic.
Thank you. Thank you for your excellent talk. So I just wanted to go back to the inspector role, and you talked about auditing, preventing financial crime. I was wondering if would you be able to talk briefly on how Xi Jinping's anti-corruption drive might like tie into that, and what effect, if any, it's had in strengthening economic security? Thank you.
That's a really great question, because it gets into an area that my research as it stands doesn't have a clear discussion of, which is where political and regime stability does it or does it not bleed into this idea of economic security, right? And when I think about the anti-corruption drive, I think more about regime stability and political security as the ultimate goal, because it doesn't necessarily delve into, say, China's trading relationships, right? Or China's efforts to liberalize its financial sector or to build stability into its financial sector. It's really more about the personal behavior of party cadres and the degree to which it might be undermining the cohesion of the party and the degree to which political control can be centralized at the very top. So I do think of it as being slightly different.